Hey guys, welcome back to another long, slow descent into the mildly unpleasant world of history. So, go ahead and dim the lights, grab some tea. Or, if you want to stay in theme, maybe a cup of something vaguely herbal that tastes like sadness, and get comfortable. Because tonight, we're talking about smell, specifically how medieval people dealt with bad teeth, bad breath, and body odor before the invention of toothpaste, deodorant, or a basic understanding of bacteria. Now, the first thing we should probably admit is that the Middle Ages were not a good time to have a nose. If you were alive in, say, the year 1300, and you had functioning sinuses, congratulations, you were cursed. Because the world was, in every direction, one large, unwashed, garlic-scented soup of humanity. The smell of civilization, or lack thereof, let's start by setting the scene. Imagine a bustling medieval city. Maybe Paris, maybe London. Somewhere with cathedrals, mud, and a questionable understanding of plumbing. Now, you'd think that the smell of freshly baked bread or wood smoke might fill the air, and sometimes it did. But more often, the dominant aroma came from a delightful mix of animal dung, human waste, rotting food, and stagnant water that no one wanted to claim responsibility for. The streets were basically open sewers. Chamber pots were emptied out of windows with minimal warning. Gardaloo was the polite version of incoming, a phrase yelled before flinging a day's worth of urine onto the cobblestones. So, yes, the people were smelly, but so was everything else. And in a strange way, that made it okay. When everyone smells, no one smells. It's kind of like how in high school, everyone thought Axe body spray counted as hygiene. But let's get specific, because we're not here for vague medieval musk. We're here for the details, the soaps, the herbs, the desperate improvisations, and the medieval equivalent of breath mints that probably tasted like ground-up trees. Medieval mouths, the dental disaster zone. Let's start with teeth. If you've ever watched a medieval drama and thought, wow, everyone has surprisingly white teeth for a time without fluoride. Yeah, you're right to be suspicious. In real life, medieval mouths were complicated. Surprisingly, tooth decay wasn't as universal as you might think, at least not until sugar became fashionable. Before the late 1400s, most Europeans didn't have constant access to sweets. So while they didn't brush daily, their teeth weren't always blackened ruins either. The diet helped. Lots of grains, vegetables, and hard bread acted like a natural toothbrush. You'd chew on dense, coarse food all day, scraping plaque as you went. Kind of like if your dental hygiene routine was just eating rocks. But of course, things went wrong anyway. Medieval people did have cavities, and when they did, there were no gentle dentists with numbing gel and soft music. You went to the barber, surgeon, the same guy who cut hair, drained blood, and sometimes performed amputations on the side. Need a tooth pulled, he'd probably tie it to a piece of string, attach it to a door, and call it a day. Or if he was feeling fancy, he might use iron pliers that looked like something from a blacksmith's toolkit. Painkillers? Not really. Just wine, prayers, and a strong desire to forget you ever had teeth. And brushing, it wasn't completely unheard of. People did try. They used things like rough cloth, salt, crushed herbs, or even ashes to rub on their teeth. A 12th century manuscript actually recommends a mixture of sage and salt to whiten teeth. Which, honestly, doesn't sound too bad, if you ignore the fact that whitening probably meant grinding the enamel off. Bad breath remedies, medieval edition now, bad breath, known back then as evil air of the mouth, was seen as both disgusting and kind of dangerous. Because people thought smells carried disease, so if your breath was foul, they assumed you might literally be contagious. Remedies varied wildly. Some recommended chewing parsley, mint, or cloves. Others swore by rinsing with wine or vinegar. A few even believed that putting roasted mouse brains in your mouth could help. Yes, you heard that right, mouse brains, because apparently fresh breath and rodent neuroscience were once linked concepts. Monks, who often lived in communities that couldn't exactly afford constant dental work, had their own secret weapons, herbal rinses made from fennel, rosemary, and myrrh. And in medieval Islamic medicine, Scholars like Avicenna actually wrote detailed notes about oral hygiene, recommending miswak sticks, basically natural toothbrushes made from tree twigs. Those, to be fair, did work. Modern studies show miswak can fight bacteria. So props to the medieval Muslim world for being ahead of the curve, while Europe was still gargling with vinegar and mouse bits. The soap situation lets glide from mouths to bodies. Now, bathing is one of those subjects where popular myth meets awkward truth. You've probably heard the line that medieval people never bathed. That's not quite true. They did bathe, just irregularly. Early medieval Europeans actually liked bathing, especially in public bathhouses. Think of them as a mix between a spa and a gossip lounge, where you could soak, eat, drink, and discuss who was secretly cheating on their spouse. Bathhouses were social hubs, but around the 14th century, the church decided that maybe all that naked mingling wasn't great for moral purity. So bathhouses started shutting down, especially after plagues swept through Europe. The logic went something like, if water can carry disease and also sin, maybe we should just skip bathing altogether. Brilliant, instead. People turned to what was called dry washing. This meant rubbing yourself with linen cloths, or dabbing perfume and vinegar water on your skin to pretend you were clean. It's the medieval version of body spray and hope for the best. Soap existed, but it was harsh and expensive. Early soap was made from animal fat and lye, so washing with it was a bit like scouring yourself with bacon-flavored chemicals. Only the wealthy used it regularly. Everyone else just accepted being slightly sticky forever. Perfumes, powders, and the art of deodorant now. You can't talk about medieval hygiene without mentioning perfume, because while they couldn't always wash the smell off, they could cover it. Perfume was a huge part of noble life. Ladies would carry pomanders, little metal balls filled with fragrant herbs like cloves, lavender, and cinnamon, to sniff when the air got too foul. Men might wear perfumed gloves or dab rosewater on their collars. One chronicler described the French court of the 15th century as a cloud of scent and sin, which, honestly, is the best possible review of medieval fashion. For body odor specifically, people used powders made of talc, ground roses, or even crushed violets. In Spain, the Moors had brought advanced perfumery techniques from the Islamic world, which made Iberian nobles smell slightly less medieval than their northern neighbors. So, if you ever walked into a medieval ballroom, the scent would have been confusing, a mix of unwashed humans, rotting meat, animal fat candles, and a faint whisper of rosewater trying its best to win the battle. Hair, beards, and everything in between now, hair care, because if your body smells bad, your hair will absolutely join the party. Shampoo as we know it didn't exist. People washed their hair with plain water, sometimes mixed with vinegar, rosemary, or lye soap. If you were noble, you might add scented oils after, or olive oil, almond oil, or even bear grease, which was literally rendered bear fat. Why bear? Because apparently it gave your hair a luxurious shine. Beards were also high maintenance. Knights and noblemen often perfumed their beards, combed them with ivory combs, and shaped them carefully. Peasants, well, they mostly let nature take its course. Hygiene and class, a smelly divide. The thing about medieval hygiene is that it wasn't just about what you could do. It was about what you were allowed to do. The wealthy had servants to haul hot water, perfumers to craft oils, and barbers to handle grooming. The poor had a bucket, a stream, and hope. And while nobles reeked of musk and ambergris, peasants reeked of sweat and dirt. But interestingly, the wealthy weren't necessarily cleaner. They just smelled more expensive. Royalty took pride in exotic perfumes and cleansing rituals, even if those rituals didn't involve actual soap. For example, Queen Elizabeth I of England supposedly bathed once a month, whether she needed it or not. A statement that raises more questions than it answers. Medical theories and the smell of health now. Here's where things get pseudo-scientific. Medieval medicine believed that the body's smells were tied to its humors, the four fluids that supposedly controlled your health: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If you smelled bad, it meant your humors were corrupted. So, Physicians prescribed sweating, purging, or bloodletting to restore balance. That's right. If you stank, the solution was to bleed you a little, because why not double down on the problem? Doctors even warned that washing too much could open the pores and let in disease. So you were supposed to keep yourself sealed, which is a poetic way of saying, please marinate in your own filth for safety. A glimpse of clean, the medieval bath ritual still, not everyone gave up bathing entirely. Some regions, especially in Scandinavia and parts of Germany, kept the bathing tradition alive. Public bathhouses remained popular there well into the 16th century. Bathing wasn't just hygiene, it was therapy. You'd soak in herbal, infused water, maybe with chamomile, thyme, or sage. Sometimes wine was added, because why not? Afterward, you'd dry off with linen, oil your skin, and sit around chatting. It was social, relaxing, and, for a brief moment, almost modern. But even then, baths weren't frequent. Once a week was luxurious. Once a month was normal. The average peasant might bathe only a few times a year, if ever, and honestly, no one judged. Because when you live surrounded by horses, fires, and people who think plague comes from night air, clean is a very flexible concept. Let's drift gently here, because that's enough body odor for one segment. In the next part, we'll float deeper into the strange medieval world of perfumed nobles, toothless kings, and weird medical advice about smell and sin. Because if you thought this was the worst of it, well, you'd be wrong. Hey again, if you're still awake, congratulations. That means you have a stronger tolerance for medieval hygiene than most nobles did for soap. So, let's sink a little deeper into the scented swamp of royal cleanliness. Because while peasants were out there sharing bathwater and prayers, the nobility were inventing elaborate, perfumed lies about what it meant to be clean. And honestly, it's hard not to admire the confidence. Cleanliness, by association, and perfume in medieval courts. Smelling good wasn't really about health. It was about status. If you could afford perfumes imported from Venice or spices from the East, you weren't just masking your stench. You were proving your wealth. Perfume was a luxury item. It came in tiny glass bottles wrapped in silk, made from ingredients that required whole trade networks to acquire. Ambergris from Wales, musk from deer glands, civet from the rear ends of African cats. Basically, if an animal produced something smelly, someone rich was rubbing it on their wrists. Queen Isabella of Castile reportedly loved a blend of musk, rosewater, and amber. Meanwhile, in France, King Charles VI preferred lavender oil. He also thought he was made of glass and would shatter if touched, but that's another story. The logic was simple. If you smell like paradise, you must be close to God. If you smell like a pigsty, you must be spiritually compromised. So perfume became a moral choice, because why actually bathe when you could just spiritually deodorize yourself? The bath, that wasn't really a bath now. Here's something you might find oddly relatable. The wealthy often took what we might call cosmetic baths. They would fill a tub, or sometimes just a wooden barrel, with lukewarm water, toss in rose petals, herbs, and maybe a splash of milk, then sit there for 10 minutes pretending to be refreshed. No scrubbing, no soap, just a gentle soak and a deep sense of accomplishment. Servants would bring scented cloths to wipe down arms and faces afterward. Then they'd dust themselves with rice powder or ground flowers to seal in the cleanliness. Basically, the medieval version of a luxury spa day. Minus, hygiene. And in fairness, it wasn't all laziness. Hot water was hard to get. You needed fires, wood, time, and servants. So if you were rich enough to make it happen, you were already ahead of the game. For peasants, the bath might just be standing in the rain once in a while and hoping for the best. The politics of smell wasn't just personal, it was political. Rulers were expected to embody purity. Chroniclers described kings by their fragrance, as if holiness could be measured in rosewater concentration. Saintly figures were said to emit pleasant scents even after death. This odor of sanctity was considered proof of divine favor. Which is, let's be honest, a convenient PR move for the church. Don't mind the corpse. If it smells like lilies, it's holy. On the flip side, heretics and sinners were said to stink of sulfur. So smell literally divided heaven and hell. Imagine being accused of witchcraft just because you forgot to use rosewater that morning. Royal mouths, a dental tragedy now. Let's wander back into the mouth, because royal dentistry was its own kind of horror show. By the late Middle Ages, sugar was becoming a fashionable import. It was rare, expensive, and considered almost medicinal. So naturally, royals used it like it was health food. Cakes, candies, honeyed wine. Sugar was everywhere in the courts of Europe. And their teeth paid the price. Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen herself, had famously blackened teeth by middle age. It wasn't just gossip. Foreign ambassadors actually commented on it. Her breath, apparently, was less than divine. But here's the kicker. Black teeth became fashionable, because if the Queen's teeth were ruined by sugar, then ruined teeth must be a sign of wealth. So some nobles literally darkened their own teeth with soot to look rich. Yes, medieval people invented influencer culture centuries early. Dentistry, if you can call it that, was done by barbers or tooth drawers. There were no dental schools, just tools, bravery, and alcohol. If you had an abscess, you might be told to gargle with urine, which was believed to be antiseptic, and disturbingly, that part wasn't totally wrong. Urine is mildly sterile, still, probably not worth the trade-off. A medieval dental routine, if you were one of the few who cared about oral hygiene, your options were creative. You could chew fennel seeds or cloves for freshness. You might rub your teeth with powdered coral or burnt bread. And if you were really fancy, you could use a brush made of horsehair. Some medieval recipes for toothpaste survive. One from the 14th century included burnt salt, pepper, and vinegar, mixed into a gritty paste. Another advised adding honey to make it agreeable to the taste, which probably turned it into sticky dental glue. Still, people cared. They might not have known about bacteria, but they knew rotten teeth hurt, and bad breath made conversation awkward. So they improvised, painfully, often hilariously, but sincerely. Medieval medicine's greatest misses now. Let's drift over to the medical theories again, because those are always fun in a please don't try this at home way. Physicians of the time believed illness came from imbalances, and smells were symptoms. If you reeked, it meant your humors were overheating, or your organs were stewing in bad vapors. So they prescribed purging. You'd drink laxatives, vomit, inducing potions, or sweat it out in steam baths. Yes, even back then, detox culture was alive and well. The irony is, some of it worked accidentally. Sweating did clean the pores. Herbal steams did kill some bacteria, but mostly these cures were just medieval spa torture with bonus dehydration, and when in doubt, doctors burned herbs like rosemary, juniper, and sage around the room to purify the air, which coincidentally is how incense became part of religious rituals. So next time you smell incense in an old cathedral, remember it started as medieval febres. Cleanliness and sin, the church weighs in Let's Talk Religion because the church had opinions, with a capital O about washing. On one hand, cleanliness was associated with godliness. On the other, enjoying warm water and soap was seen as suspiciously indulgent. So the official stance became something like, be clean in soul, not in body. Monks were instructed to wash only their hands and faces regularly. Full baths were discouraged except for medical reasons, or for Easter if they were feeling festive. 1/12th century abbot even said, to wash the body is to soil the soul, which sounds profound until you realize he probably just hated doing laundry. Still, monasteries weren't totally grimy. Some had running water systems, especially in more advanced abbeys. The Cistercians, for instance, were famous for their engineering skills. They built aqueducts and fountains so they could wash hands before meals. So it wasn't all filth and faith. Some monks genuinely believed hygiene was a kind of discipline. But for most people, washing too much was seen as vanity. You didn't want to look like you cared about appearances. Smelling neutral was enough. Medieval deodorant, the powder parade now. Let's check in on body odor again, because honestly, that's the heart of this topic. When baths faded from fashion, powders took over. Ladies dusted themselves with orris root, a powder made from the dried roots of irises. It smelled faintly like violets and stuck to the skin for days. Men preferred musk or ambergris, based powders, which gave them a heavier, animal scent. Clothing was also perfumed. People would sprinkle herbs inside their shirts and wrap lavender sachets into their sleeves. If you hugged someone, you'd probably get a noseful of herbal dust and regret. Beds, too, were perfumed. Sheets were sprinkled with rosewater or vinegar before guests arrived, because if you can't clean the mattress, at least you can make it smell like salad dressing. The plague years, when smell became a matter of life and death now, here's where things take a darker, but still oddly bureaucratic turn. When the Black Death hit Europe in the 14th century, people were desperate for explanations. Doctors believed plague was spread by miasma, poisonous air filled with corruption, so the only defense, they thought, was to smell better than the air around you. People carried pomadas, little metal balls filled with herbs and vinegar, soaked sponges. They walked through the streets holding them to their noses like fancy gas masks. Plague doctors, with their famous beaked masks, stuffed the beaks with rosemary, camphor, and cloves. It was meant to protect them from bad air, though in reality, it just made them smell slightly more decorative before they also died. Cities burned incense in the streets, hung flowers in windows, and banned butchers from working inside city walls. It didn't work, obviously, but at least the place smelled better for a while. The strange comfort of filth, and yet, after centuries of dirt, people got used to it. Smell was part of life, just another background note in the daily medieval soundtrack. There's even a strange charm to it. They didn't know better, but they made do. They found ways to feel dignified, even when surrounded by chaos and questionable hygiene. Because underneath all the filth, perfumes, and burned herbs, people still wanted what we want, to be seen as clean, respectable, and human. And maybe that's the softest, most relatable part of medieval life. They weren't monsters, just people, trying to smell slightly less terrible. Let's drift onward. In Part 3, we'll step into the world of royal bath rituals, weird medical spa trends, and the strange intersection of vanity, superstition, and soap. Because the story of medieval cleanliness is only getting murkier. Hey again, night owls. If you're still here, you've officially outlasted the average medieval soap bar. Tonight, we wade deeper into the tepid waters of royal hygiene, those perfumed, steaming tubs where history met delusion, and everyone thought wine could cure disease. Because the truth is, medieval royals loved the idea of bathing. They just didn't love the part where they actually got wet. The bath that launched 1,000 towels. Let's start with one of history's great bath enthusiasts, King Henry Roman III of France. Henry was obsessed with cleanliness. He bathed almost daily, a shocking display of hygiene at the time, and had entire rooms perfumed with rose oil before he entered. His courtiers thought it was eccentric, maybe even effeminate, but Henry didn't care. He'd sit in his perfumed tub, surrounded by servants fanning him with feathers, probably congratulating himself for being the cleanest man in France, and honestly, fair enough. If you lived in a world where weekly rinse was considered obsessive, daily baths made you a revolutionary. But Henry was the exception. For most kings and queens, bathing was a spectacle, part ritual, part performance, and part social event. In noble households, a bath wasn't a private act. Servants heated water over fires, carried it in buckets, and poured it into a wooden tub lined with linen. Perfumed oils, herbs, or even slices of bread were added supposedly to soothe the skin and absorb impurities. Because of course bread fixes everything, then came the food. Yes, nobles ate while they bathed. Platters of roast chicken, fruit, and wine were set on little tables next to the tub. So you'd soak in lukewarm herbal broth while munching on grapes and slowly turning into soup yourself. There are actual accounts of nobles hosting meetings in their baths discussing politics while half naked and lightly perfumed, Imagine trying to negotiate taxes while your feet prune. The bath as medicine now, in fairness. They didn't think baths were just for smell. Bathing was seen as medical, a way to balance the humors and draw out toxins. Doctors prescribed baths for everything from melancholy to gout. A 15th century health manual actually suggested that lukewarm baths restore the vigor of the mind and expel sadness. Which, honestly, sounds like good advice right until the part where they also added, but avoid hot water, for it weakens the liver and softens the brain. Herbal baths were popular prescriptions. Rose for joy. Lavender for headaches. Thyme for courage somehow. And if you were feeling particularly unlucky, your physician might tell you to bathe in wine or milk, which sounds luxurious, but mostly left you smelling like curdled regret. Medieval spas. The original wellness retreats. Let's glide over to the medieval spa scene, because yes, there were spa towns. Places like Bath in England, Baden in Germany, and Spa in Belgium, literally the origin of the word, were famous for their mineral springs. People believed these waters had healing powers. Kings, bishops, and merchants traveled there to soak, sweat, and gossip about who was dying of what. It was equal parts medical pilgrimage and elite vacation. Of course, these spas didn't always live up to their reputations. The water was often cloudy, the facilities smelled of sulfur, and bathing with strangers meant exchanging more diseases than miracles. But the idea persisted because even in the Middle Ages, people loved the fantasy of a detox. The difference is, their detox involved boiling themselves in mystery soup instead of green smoothies. Soap, the unloved hero. Let's talk about soap, the most misunderstood object of the medieval world. Soap had existed since Roman times, made from animal fat and ash. It worked, but it wasn't glamorous. It was harsh, smelled bad, and left your skin feeling like a burnt sausage. By the Middle Ages, soap making had become a profession. Cities like Marseille and Naples produced soap in bulk using olive oil, making it smoother and less destructive to skin. This was Mediterranean luxury soap, the Chanel No. 5 of the medieval world, but up north, where animal fat was easier to find than olive oil, soap stayed brutal. So peasants used lye, heavy bars that could peel paint. And here's the twist. As Christianity grew more ascetic, the church's stance on soap grew weirder. Bathing was fine, unless it was for pleasure, and since nice soap made bathing pleasant, it was viewed with suspicion. By the 13th century, some clergy were preaching that frequent bathing was vanity, and scented soap was borderline sinful. So naturally, nobles ignored them and bought more. When clean meant moral, there was this strange paradox in medieval thought: the cleaner you smelled, the holier you looked. Not because of actual hygiene, but because good smells symbolized spiritual purity. So saints were described as emitting sweet fragrances after death. Literally, their corpses were said to smell like roses, even in decay. Meanwhile, sinners and heretics were believed to rot faster and stink worse. This wasn't just poetry, it was theology. To smell good was to be chosen. To smell bad was to be cursed. So, of course, royalty leaned into it. They surrounded themselves with flowers, spices, and incense, hoping to smell their way into heaven. Perfumed oils became a status symbol. Courtiers competed to invent the most refined scents, mixing imported oils from Damascus, Venice, and Constantinople. Some recipes even used ground pearls and gold dust because if your goal is to mask sweat, why not do it with literal money? The barber, surgeon, part hairstylist, part horror movie now. Let's glide briefly into the world of the barber, surgeon again. Because no discussion of medieval hygiene is complete without them. These were the multitaskers of the Middle Ages. They cut hair, pulled teeth, set bones, performed minor surgeries, and occasionally shaved the heads of monks who couldn't reach the back. A barber's pole with its red and white stripes comes from that tradition. The red symbolizes blood, the white for bandages. So next time you see one, remember it's not just about grooming, it's about 14th sensory multitasking, and mild trauma. Barbers also handled lice, which were a constant plague. They'd shave heads completely, especially during outbreaks of disease. Wigs were then worn over the bald scalp, perfumed heavily with lavender or ambergris to keep the lice from returning. It didn't work, but at least everyone smelled committed. Royal hair care, grease, powder, and denial hair was everything in court culture. A shiny mane meant vitality, so people went to absurd lengths to achieve it. Men used animal fats and oils to style their hair, sometimes even goose fat, mixed with rosewater. Women preferred herbal concoctions, rosemary rinses, chamomile infusions, or, bizarrely, pigeon droppings. Yes, pigeon poop was believed to make hair soft and glossy. The results predictably varied. To hide the grease, nobles sprinkled their hair with perfumed powders. It created that powdered, fluffy look you sometimes see in medieval portraits, not elegance, just desperation disguised as fashion. And of course, hats were essential, not just for style, but to cover the ongoing war between human and lice. Clean beds, dirty cities inside castles, hygiene was relative. Royal chambers were perfumed, sheets changed occasionally, and everything looked luxurious, but underneath it was chaos. People dumped chamber pots out windows, dogs roamed freely indoors, and food scraps piled up near doors. Even the cleanest noble slept, surrounded by fleas. Queen Isabella of France reportedly slept with a silver basin of water near her bed to wash away sin upon waking. A poetic idea. That didn't help with the fleas. Cities were worse. In Paris, regulations in the 13th century required butchers to dump animal remains outside the city walls, which was considerate until the wind changed direction. In London, there were laws against throwing waste into the Thames. Everyone ignored them. The smell of the river was so bad that chroniclers claimed angels turned away from it, which is arguably the first recorded case of divine olfactory trauma. The medieval nose, weaponized adaptation after a few generations, people stopped noticing the smell. Travelers from cleaner regions, like certain Islamic or Byzantine territories, often wrote horrified accounts of Western Europe. One 12th century Arab traveler visiting Paris described it as a magnificent city filled with filth, which, yes, is still an accurate tagline, but medieval noses adapted. They tuned out the stench the way we tune out traffic noise. It became part of the background, the scent of life itself. When cleanliness made a comeback by the late 15th century, things began to shift. The Renaissance brought renewed interest in classical ideas, and with them Roman-style bathing. People rediscovered the joy of being both clean and alive. Public baths reopened, though cautiously. New soap recipes spread through Europe, and perfumed oils became sophisticated art forms. Bathing was once again linked with beauty, health, and even romance. Poets began describing lovers as fresh as spring water, which must have been a revelation after centuries of comparing them to musk and dust. But even then, full bathing remained a luxury. Most Europeans didn't adopt daily washing until the 18th or 19th century. So while progress was made, the smell of the Middle Ages lingered metaphorically and literally for a long time. And with that, we'll let the warm bathwater cool. In Part 4, we'll drift into how medieval fashion played its part, how layers of velvet, wool, and fur became both protection and punishment in the age of sweat, and how nobles learned to weaponize scent like political perfume. So take a deep breath, preferably of modern soap, scented air, and prepare for another long, drowsy dive into the medieval nose. All right, still awake, or at least semi-conscious, perfect, because this next stretch of our sleepy medieval spa story brings us into the gilded courts where bad hygiene met good perfume, and somehow everyone pretended it all balanced out. You see, for medieval royalty, the goal wasn't actually to be clean. It was to smell clean, or at least to smell expensive. And that, my tired friend, is where the world of oils, flowers, and unholy concoctions enters the royal routine. Let's begin with the obvious. The higher your rank, the stronger your stench, covering power. Peasants may have had dung and onion on their breath, but nobles, oh, They had musk and animal gland secretion that smelled like a mix of old leather and regret. Musk, ambergris, civet, all these were the luxury scents of the day, because nothing says royalty quite like wearing a whale's digestive product around your neck. Perfume wasn't about seduction back then. It was about protection. People genuinely believed that pleasant smells warded off disease. If the air smelled sweet, it must be healthy. If it reeked, it must carry death. So nobles doused themselves in rosewater and sandalwood oil, not just to impress, but to survive. And naturally, they'd mock peasants for not doing the same, ignoring the fact that the peasants couldn't exactly afford imported ambergris from a whale's stomach. Let's drift for a moment to the French court, because, let's be honest, no one loved denial quite like the French aristocracy. The Palace of Versailles, in all its golden glory, was essentially one big scented deception. Beneath the silks and marble halls lurked, well, the smell of thousands of unwashed bodies and a few too many chamber pots. The perfume was thick enough to stun a goat, but it didn't hide much. Visitors often remarked that Versailles looked like heaven, but smelled like an overcrowded barn. Yet the courtiers kept spraying, splashing, and powdering themselves with perfumes made of orange blossoms, lavender, and whatever exotic flowers they could import. Let's float gently back in time to the medieval courts of England, where the situation was just as fragrant. Medieval kings weren't necessarily better groomed, just better perfumed. Henry Roman III of England, for instance, was known to adore scents. He ordered shipments of rosewater and herbs to be sprinkled around his palace. Rosewater fountains, herb-stuffed cushions, essentially medieval air fresheners. But here's the irony: all that scenting did little against the underlying problem. No one was washing. Soap was rare and, frankly, suspicious. Many believed hot water opened the pores, letting in illness. So instead of scrubbing off the filth, they'd just layer floral water on top. Imagine centuries of royalty walking around smelling like sweaty roses and decaying lilacs, the original masking spray. And while we're here, let's not forget medieval dentistry's royal touch. Even kings and queens weren't immune to the tooth rot epidemic. Sugar was a luxury, and the rich indulged freely. Queen Elizabeth I, centuries later, would inherit the full consequences of this teeth so blackened that foreign envoys mistook her dark gums for fashionable makeup. She wasn't medieval, but the roots of that dental disaster started long before her. Medieval nobles often used powders made of crushed herbs, salt, or even burnt bread to clean their teeth. The idea was noble, the method destructive. It stripped enamel faster than you could say halitosis. They'd rub their teeth with cloths dipped in vinegar, wine, or ashes. The result? Gums that bled, teeth that wobbled, and smiles that, well, looked better in dim candlelight. Now imagine this scene: a court banquet in the 13th century. A long table heavy with roasted meats, garlic sauce, and honeyed wine. The nobles laugh their breath, a complex mixture of onions, cloves, and mild decay. Perfume wafts through the air, trying to keep up. It's like a battlefield between scent and stench, and no one wins. But despite the smell, everyone insisted it was divine, because, of course, if you're rich, your sweat smells like success. Peasants' sweat, filth, nobles' sweat, purity and piety. It's funny how class can change the fragrance of the exact same odor. Even the clergy had opinions about scent. Monks often argued that bathing was a vanity, while bishops commissioned sweet-smelling oils for spiritual purity. Some monasteries even had special herbal rooms not for bathing, but for inhaling cleansing aromas. Because apparently, sniffing mint was as good as washing your armpits. Let's float over to another courtly habit: scented gloves. A must-have accessory for both fashion and survival. You'd perfume your gloves with lavender, myrrh, or orange peel, so that when shaking someone's hand, you wouldn't pass out from the combined smell of sweat, garlic, and bad breath. Catherine de' Medici made them wildly popular in Renaissance France, but the roots were medieval. Perfumed gloves were the medieval equivalent of hand sanitizer, just, less effective. By now, you might be realizing that medieval people weren't completely unaware of hygiene, they just had it backwards. They wanted to smell nice, but didn't connect that with actually being clean. Scent was moral. Cleanliness was medical, and water was risky. So instead of soap and water, they lived in a world of powders, flowers, and oils. They'd sprinkle dried lavender in their clothes, stuff herbs in their hats, and hang perfumed balls pomanders around their necks. These pomanders were basically medieval air fresheners you wore on your body. Silver orbs filled with amber, spices, and other ingredients that screamed I'm wealthy and mildly paranoid. And in fairness, they weren't wrong to be afraid of air. The miasma theory, the idea that disease traveled through bad air, was gospel truth until well into the modern era. So masking odor wasn't just vanity. It was self-defense. But still, it didn't make them smell any better. It just made them smell like perfumed rot. And on that gently depressing note, let's drift to another corner of medieval life where hygiene met medicine. Spoiler, it's not going to get cleaner, but it's going to get stranger. Because if you think covering your smell with whale vomit was odd, wait until you hear what passed for healing baths. So we've dabbed ourselves in whale vomit perfume, brushed our teeth with ashes, and called it a day. Lovely. But now, let's float over into the slightly steamy, slightly suspicious world of medieval medicine, where doctors and bathhouses teamed up to prove that good intentions don't always lead to good hygiene. Bathhouses were everywhere in medieval Europe, and at first glance, that sounds promising. Communal bathing sounds civilized, even luxurious, right. But as with most things medieval, the reality was complicated. Early medieval people, especially in cities like Paris or London, genuinely enjoyed bathing. They saw it as social, even romantic. Picture it, tubs lined up in warm wooden rooms, people chatting, eating, and sometimes, doing more than chatting. Because yes, bathhouses eventually became such centers of extracurricular activity that the church started calling them dens of sin. Naturally, when something's fun, the church bans it. So, over time, public bathhouses fell out of favor. People didn't stop sweating. Of course, they just stopped washing together. But for a while, bathhouses were as close as you got to medieval wellness spas. Doctors recommended them for everything from headaches to melancholy. Feeling sad? Sit in hot water with herbs. Have a rash? Same solution. Scurvy? Hot water. Existential dread? More hot water. Herbal baths were big business. Medieval physicians would mix up blends of rosemary, thyme, and sage for your humors. You'd sit there, inhaling the fragrant steam, imagining yourself getting holier by the minute. It was relaxation meets superstition. And since we're already here, let's take a brief moment to appreciate medieval medical logic, or the lack thereof. Doctors in the Middle Ages didn't talk about bacteria or germs. They talked about balance. Everything revolved around the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If you were unwell, one of these was out of balance. So, say you had acne. That meant too much heat. Maybe you were angry recently. The cure: cool baths, or in some cases, bloodletting, because clearly, if you lose a pint of blood, your complexion improves, right? Others believed in sweating out impurities. You'd be wrapped in blankets, placed near heat, and made to sweat like a roast chicken. It wasn't pleasant, but hey, at least you came out smelling faintly of thyme. Meanwhile, some royal physicians had creative ideas about dental health. Medieval texts include recipes like this one. Boil a hare's head in vinegar, mix with ashes, and rub upon the gums. Because apparently, if your teeth aren't falling out fast enough, this will finish the job. And if that didn't work, there was always urine. Yes, you heard that right. Medieval people, even educated ones, believed urine was cleansing. It was used in laundry, medicine, and, disturbingly, dental care. The ammonia in it did technically clean things, but, well, we'll just let that image linger while you sip your tea. Now, to be fair, not every medieval person was clueless about hygiene. Monks, for instance, often had surprisingly strict cleanliness rules. Most monasteries had designated washrooms, and many monks bathed at least weekly. Shocking, I know. Some even brushed their teeth with mint and salt mixtures. Monastic life, not glamorous, but apparently minty fresh. The trouble started when religious authorities decided that bathing too often was sinful. The logic: cleanliness encouraged vanity, and vanity led to lust. And lust, of course, led straight to eternal doom. So, gradually, people stopped bathing regularly. By the later Middle Ages, it wasn't uncommon for someone to go months, even years, without a proper wash. They'd just change shirts, rub scented herbs under their arms, and call it progress. Speaking of shirts, linen was the unsung hero of medieval hygiene. Since most people didn't bathe much, they used linen garments to clean their skin by absorption. They'd wear a fresh undershirt, let it soak up the body's oils, then swap it out and call it a wash day. It worked surprisingly well, if you ignored the smell, and if you were rich, your linens were perfumed too. The smell of freshly laundered linen was almost a moral badge. You might not be clean, but at least your clothes pretended you were. Let's drift back for a moment to royal bath routines, because those were something else entirely. Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of her age, was rumored to have bathed in wine and milk. Whether that's true or not, it tells you a lot about the vibe, decadence, myth, and a touch of sticky skin afterward. Other monarchs had personal bath attendants, people whose entire job was to prepare and test the water. Medieval royalty took their baths surrounded by servants, musicians, and sometimes even food. Nothing says relaxation quite like bathing while a lute player strums nearby and someone reads out the latest political gossip. But even these indulgences weren't common. Most medieval kings, queens, and nobles only bathed on special occasions. A coronation, a wedding, maybe after a crusade. Henry Roman IV of France once bragged that he only washed his entire body a few times a year, and that was considered sophisticated restraint. To them, overbathing was dangerous. Water was thought to open the pores, letting in sickness. So the idea of daily showers would have sounded downright reckless. It wasn't until centuries later, around the Enlightenment, that people started associating bathing with health rather than harm. Until then, everyone just kept perfuming, powdering, and praying. The idea of internal cleanliness mattered more than external cleanliness. A good confession could wash the soul, who cared if the body still smelled like boiled mutton and despair. Let's float back to the streets for a moment, because while royals and monks were debating baths, the average medieval town smelled like, well, everything at once: open drains, fish markets, tanneries, and horse manure. Add a touch of perfume and garlic breath, and you had the signature scent of 14th century Europe, and yet people got used to it. They didn't think of it as dirty, it was simply life. And knows, blind society marching through history, blissfully unaware that one day we'd look back and think, wow, that's horrifying. Still, to them, bad smells were natural. Disease, moral decay, and sin were the real filth. So if your body stank but your soul was clean, you were doing fine. And on that fragrant note, let's ease our way into something a little darker: how plagues, death, and medicine shaped people's ideas of cleanliness. Because nothing changes hygiene habits quite like watching half your village disappear. All right, drift back in. Take a slow breath. The candles are still flickering, the medieval streets are still pungent, and now we arrive at one of history's least relaxing events, the Black Death. Now, don't worry, we're not diving into gore or screams here. We're floating calmly through one of humanity's worst hygiene lessons. Because nothing says maybe we should rethink our cleanliness, quite like a pandemic that wiped out a third of Europe. When the Black Death rolled in during the mid-14th century, people didn't exactly connect it to fleas or rats. Germs weren't part of their vocabulary yet. What they did have, though, was the miasma theory, the belief that disease came from bad air. Literally, poisonous vapors, they called them. So if the air smelled foul, it must carry death. Naturally, people responded in the only way they knew how, by trying to make everything smell nice. If you lived through this era, your number one defense wasn't washing your hands, it was sniffing herbs. Doctors carried posies, bundles of flowers or spices to keep the air away. Perfume sellers got rich. And everyone walked around clutching roses, vinegar cloths, or dried lavender under their noses. Remember those like plague doctor masks, the ones that look like something from a haunted carnival? The long beak wasn't just for style. It was packed with herbs, mint, cloves, myrrh, anything to filter out the smell of death. It didn't work, of course, but at least they smelled fancy while failing. Now, here's where things got truly ironic. People were told not to bathe during the plague years. Doctors warned that hot water opened the pores, and that disease could slip in. Clean skin was vulnerable skin. So, in an act of hygienic self-sabotage, people stopped washing altogether. They sealed themselves in perfumed layers, wool, silk, linen, anything to block the air. Windows stayed shut. Fires burned constantly to purify the rooms. And the smell of smoke mixed with unwashed humanity until the air itself became a weapon. There are stories gross stories of people refusing to change clothes for months. Entire households locked themselves away, bathing in vinegar fumes and incense. If they died, well, at least they died fragrant. Meanwhile, the church kept up its strange relationship with hygiene. Some clerics saw the plague as God's punishment for vanity. Others recommended spiritual cleansing prayer, fasting, and yes, avoiding baths. Because clearly, soap was no match for sin. And yet, amid the chaos, a few physicians began to notice something odd. People who worked with water bathhouse workers, butchers, even tanners sometimes survived more often than the rest. Coincidence, maybe, or maybe those people accidentally stumbled upon basic sanitation before science existed, but no one connected those dots just yet. So, for centuries, the fear of bathing lingered. By the 15th century, public baths were almost extinct in many places. What had once been social hubs turned into suspicious relics. Bathing, people whispered, causes illness. And in fairness, sometimes it did, since the water wasn't exactly clean to begin with. Recycled bath water, crowded tubs, and questionable patrons made for some bacterial soup. So, instead of washing, people doubled down on dry cleaning medieval style, linen shirts, herbal powders, vinegar rubs. The body stayed dry, and the soul hopefully stayed pure. Let's take a slow stroll through a medieval apothecary for a moment, a small, dim room filled with jars and dried herbs. It smells like rosemary, wine, and mild panic. Here, you'd buy your plague prevention supplies. Rosewater, camphor, vinegar cloths, or plague waters made of wine and herbs. You might even pick up a pomander, a silver ball filled with scented ingredients. You'd hang it around your neck or belt, hoping it would scare off invisible evil. Did it work? Not even close. But it gave people comfort, and sometimes that's all survival really is, a good placebo wrapped in rose petals. Let's float briefly into the homes of the wealthy. The noble class had its own rituals for warding off sickness. They'd burn juniper or sage inside their halls, sprinkle herbs on the floor, and fill their rooms with fragrant flowers. The more it smelled like a meadow, the safer they felt. Of course, by now the air inside these castles was a thick soup of smoke, sweat, herbs, and candle grease. Windows were rarely opened. Bathing was still minimal. So while people thought they were protecting themselves, they were essentially marinating in centuries of scent and bacteria. There's something strangely cozy about that image, though in a sad, sleepy way. A whole civilization convinced that washing would kill them, but perfume might save them, and that mindset didn't fade quickly. Even after the plague years passed, people clung to their scented armor. In many parts of Europe, perfume became a daily necessity, not for attraction, but for defense. By the 1005, nobles would perfume their wigs, gloves, fans, and even furniture. The air was heavy with anxiety and roses. Let's take one last slow turn into a typical 15th century physician's advice column. It might read something like this: avoid bathing, walk in the fresh air only when scented, rub vinegar upon the hands, burn herbs before guests, drink wine, not water. A charming way of saying, please don't clean yourself, but do get tipsy. And as you can imagine, This didn't do wonders for personal hygiene. People carried diseases in their clothes, their hair, even their beards. But they truly believed that as long as the air smelled pleasant, they were safe. Which brings us to the next, strangely poetic phase of European cleanliness, when the Renaissance decided to rediscover the body, and soap made its slow, fragrant comeback. So let's glide forward in time. The plague is gone, but the fear of bathing still clings like old sweat under velvet robes. Let's ease our way into the Renaissance, that elegant period of rediscovery, art, and self-congratulation, when Europe decided it was cultured again. People were painting angels on ceilings, inventing perspective, and writing poetry about anatomy. But when it came to basic hygiene, let's just say they were still a few centuries away from deodorant. The good news, soap was finally making a comeback. The bad news, hardly anyone wanted to use it. Soap itself wasn't new. The ancient Romans had it, the Arabs perfected it, and medieval Europe briefly forgot it existed. During the Renaissance, cities like Venice and Marseille began producing soap in bulk again. The rich could buy bars made with olive oil and lye, scented with herbs or citrus. The poor made do with lard and ash. Either way, if you actually used soap, you were considered oddly enthusiastic about cleanliness. For the wealthy, bathing was now more of a philosophical statement. Renaissance scholars rediscovered the Greek ideal that the body was something beautiful, a divine creation worth maintaining. They quoted Aristotle while scrubbing their elbows. But that enthusiasm was limited mostly to Italy, where warm weather and ancient ruins made public baths feel respectable again. Further north, France, England, Germany, people were slower to come around. Cold climates and colder plumbing discouraged the trend. It was one thing to paint Venus in a shell. It was another to climb into a tub of icy water and risk pneumonia for art's sake. So instead, they wiped. With linen cloths, with scented waters, with anything that avoided actual immersion. Dry baths, they called them. You'd soak a towel in wine or vinegar, rub yourself down and declare victory. A nice buzz, a clean conscience, and technically cleaner skin. Perfume reached its golden age during this time. Think of it as deodorant, mood stabilizer, and class marker all in one. Italian perfumers exported their formulas across Europe. Grasse, in southern France, became the capital of good smells. Nobles bathed their gloves, wigs, and even letters in scent. When you received a note from someone important, it smelled like their entire personality compressed into rose water. Catherine de Medici, again ahead of the curve, had her own private perfumer. She also popularized those perfumed gloves we mentioned earlier. They were fashionable and allegedly protective, because if your hands smelled like orange blossoms, plague couldn't possibly touch you. It was flawed logic, but very on brand for the 1500s. Meanwhile, tooth care was evolving, slightly. Dentists, yes, that word finally existed, were beginning to appear. Their tools looked like torture devices, and their methods were equally soothing. A Renaissance tooth extraction involved a metal screw and a prayer. Still, people did start brushing, often with twigs or soft cloths dipped in salt and sage. If you were lucky, your barber, surgeon sold a mint-flavored powder that didn't erode enamel completely. Progress and hair, oh, hair was its own battlefield. Renaissance people adored elaborate hairstyles, but washing them was still considered risky. Instead, they dusted their scalps with powders and perfumes. The result was a sort of fragrant dandruff that could knock out a canary. Let's float gently through a Renaissance palace, just to set the scene. Imagine walking through the corridors of Florence or Ferrara. The floors are strewn with herbs, rosemary, lavender, chamomile, partly for decoration, partly because the servants keep dropping food. The air smells of wax candles, rosewater, and a faint undernote of sweat. Courtiers glide by in layers of silk, their collars stiff with starch and perfume. Everyone looks perfect from a distance, but up close, it's a sensory experience. And yet, this was progress. People cared again. Not because science told them to, but because art did. Beauty demanded cleanliness, or at least the illusion of it. Portraits began to show fresh skin, flushed cheeks, gleaming hair, even if the reality was still bathe once a month and hope for the best. It was the thought that counted. In the medical world, some doctors started recommending regular washing of the hands, the face, even the whole body. A radical idea. They wrote careful disclaimers like, "Bathe when the moon is right, and only if the water is pure." Translation, "Please don't die of typhoid." But the conversation had begun. By the 16th century, soap became a respectable household item again. The Venetians made translucent bars that were practically works of art. The French added olive oil for softness. England, predictably, taxed it because why not make cleanliness a luxury? The best soaps were scented with herbs or imported oils. Ordinary people boiled fat and ash in their kitchens, producing something that worked but smelled like regret. Still, things were looking up. Bathing started to shift from sin to self-care. The idea that water was dangerous slowly faded. Travelers returning from the Ottoman Empire told tales of hammams, vast marble baths, where people actually enjoyed getting clean. Europeans were fascinated and slightly scandalized. A public bath that was both moral and steamy, unthinkable, and yet the fashion spread. Private bathhouses reappeared in Italian cities. Royals built fancy tubs in their palaces. Henry Roman VIII had his own indoor bath fed by hot springs, though how often he used it is anyone's guess. Given his general vibe, probably not daily. Let's pause on that for a moment, the idea of private bathing. It was revolutionary. For most of human history, cleaning was communal. You went to the river, the stream, or the bathhouse. But now, if you were rich, you could wash alone. Privacy became part of luxury. Soap, scent, solitude, the holy trinity of noble hygiene, and the body itself started to matter in a new way. Renaissance thinkers, inspired by anatomy and sculpture, began to admire cleanliness as part of beauty. Michelangelo's David didn't look like he skipped showers. Painters depicted saints who were radiant, not crusty. Cleanliness was becoming aspirational. Still, let's not romanticize too much. Even the most progressive noble might wash fully only a few times a year. The rest of the time, they relied on linen, powder, and confidence, but by the standards of medieval Europe, that was practically sparkling. So as we glide out of the Renaissance, the story of hygiene takes a gentle turn. People were beginning to understand that the body wasn't the enemy. Water could heal, not harm. Smell could be pleasure, not panic. And soap, humble soap, was finally something more than a suspicious alchemical brick. But the journey wasn't over. Next comes the grand age of excess, the Baroque and Enlightenment eras, when Europe decided to drown itself in perfume, wigs, and powdered hygiene illusions. Welcome to the 17th and 18th centuries, the Baroque and Enlightenment eras where Europe was dripping with perfume, lace, and philosophical confidence. Science was advancing, minds were expanding, and personal hygiene. Well, still pending, let's start at Versailles, because nothing says civilization. Like a palace with gold ceilings and no plumbing, Louis Roman XIV, the Sun King himself, reigned over a court so obsessed with appearances that reality didn't stand a chance. He bathed, allegedly, once a month, which made him a pioneer compared to most of his peers. His doctors praised him for his moderation, since too much bathing was still thought to unbalance the humors. Versailles smelled magnificent from a distance and disastrous up close. Thousands of courtiers crowded into rooms without toilets. Chamber pots overflowed. The scent of perfume battled the smell of humanity like two armies locked in eternal war. Servants scattered herbs and flowers along the corridors to mask the odor. Even the fountains outside couldn't compete. Perfume was the lifeblood of the Enlightenment elite. It wasn't just vanity, it was defense. Bad air was still thought to spread disease, so a cloud of scent became a personal force field. Lavender for protection, ambergris for power, civet for allure. Some perfumes contained more musk than scents, but they were as essential as a sword or a fan. And then there were the wigs, those towering, powdered marvels that looked like entire ecosystems balanced on people's heads. Originally, wigs were practical. When syphilis caused baldness in the 1600s, men began wearing them to hide the damage. The French court took it further. turning wigs into symbols of rank and refinement. But hygiene, oh dear, those wigs weren't washed. They were dusted, powdered with starch, scented with violet, sometimes crawling with lice. Barbers had to delouse wigs by baking them in ovens or combing through them with mercury. Laced pomades a delightful poison that made everything shiny and everyone slightly insane. And women weren't exempt. They too wore elaborate hairstyles built from pads, wire, and hairpieces. Some were so tall they couldn't fit through doors. Sleeping with them was impossible. Maintaining them was an art. The hair was often left in place for weeks, coated in powder and perfume until it resembled frosted architecture. Underneath the wigs and gowns, things weren't much fresher. Water was still suspicious. Bathing too often was believed to weaken the nerves. Instead, people changed linen constantly clean undergarments. They thought, absorbed impurities from the skin. So a noble might go months without washing but boast of freshness, because they wore crisp linen daily. This idea of dry cleanliness was so common that even medical experts endorsed it. Doctors advised wiping the body with alcohol, vinegar, or milk instead of bathing. The goal wasn't cleanliness in the modern sense. It was moral balance. The skin should breathe, not drown. Tooth care, on the other hand, had reached a turning point. Porcelain dentures appeared white, shiny, and horrifyingly impractical. Wealthy people commissioned entire sets of false teeth made from ivory or even real teeth bought from the poor. The phrase "a smile to die for" might have been disturbingly literal. Still, progress was brewing beneath the powder. The Enlightenment brought curiosity about the human body, not just its appearance, but its mechanisms. Scientists began studying anatomy, chemistry, and disease transmission. They noticed patterns. Dirty cities meant sick people. Clean water meant fewer corpses. The dots were connecting. Across Europe, public baths started to return, inspired by Ottoman and Roman traditions. In cities like Paris, bathing establishments appeared where one could soak in perfumed water and gossip about philosophy. For the first time in centuries, bathing became fashionable again, though often more sensual than sanitary. And then came the soap revolution. Chemists in France and England improved soap making, producing smoother, more effective bars. Marseille soap became famous pure olive oil, white and gentle. In England, companies like Pears began to market soap not just as a household necessity, but as a symbol of refinement. Cleanliness is next to godliness. The Victorians would soon declare, but the seeds were planted here, in the Enlightenment, where being clean was starting to sound rational. Meanwhile, in the colonies and the rising middle class, hygiene became a marker of status. If you could afford soap, linen, and the time to wash, you were civilized. Dirt was now associated with poverty, ignorance, and the past. The same nobles who had once bragged about avoiding water were suddenly preaching its virtues provided the tubs were marble and the servants filled them. Let's step inside an Enlightenment boudoir for a moment. There's a porcelain washed, and in the corner with a basin of rosewater. A wig rests on its stand, powdered and perfumed. On the vanity, brushes, mirrors, and vials of scent bergamot, jasmine, musk. A lady dabs her wrists, her neck, and behind her ears. She lifts a delicate sponge, dampens it slightly, and wipes her face. That's her morning bath. And yet, despite all the artifice, something important had changed. People were beginning to associate cleanliness with health, not just beauty. Doctors were starting to recommend regular washing of hands and faces. Midwives washed between patients. Surgeons cleaned their tools. The concept of hygiene, personal and medical, was slowly, finally, taking hold. But before we get too optimistic, remember, most common people still lived in filth. City streets were open sewers. Water was scarce or polluted. Soap was taxed and expensive. While the elite powdered themselves into marble statues, the poor still bathed in rivers and hoped not to die of dysentery. And so, as the Enlightenment turned to revolution, hygiene became political. Cleanliness was no longer just a luxury, it was a right. The idea that everyone deserved clean water, sanitation, and dignity began to stir beneath the powdered wigs and silk gloves. Because soon, very soon, the guillotine would cut more than heads, it would slice through centuries of stench and superstition. Welcome back, sleepy historians. Let's drift now into the 18th and 19th centuries, the time when the world started inventing everything and cleaning almost nothing. This is the era of revolutions, industrial smoke, and optimism mixed with cholera. People were talking about liberty and reason, but their rivers were still full of things we won't describe before bedtime. The French Revolution, for example, promised equality, but it didn't exactly deliver on plumbing. The streets of Paris were filled with slogans, sewage, and suspicion. You could be guillotined in the morning and still need to dodge chamber pots in the evening. And yet, something was shifting. For the first time, society began to see hygiene as part of progress, a social virtue. Doctors were studying the body with a seriousness that would have terrified medieval monks. They began to notice that dirt wasn't just unpleasant, it killed. Epidemics like cholera and typhus were sweeping through Europe's rapidly growing cities, and the cause wasn't witchcraft or bad vibes anymore. It was filth, real, visible, unavoidable filth. The Industrial Revolution made cities grow faster than anyone could have imagined. London's population exploded. Factories belched smoke, workers crammed into tenements, and waste human and otherwise piled up in the streets. Rivers became running latrines. The Thames turned into something between soup and tragedy. In 1858, the Great Stink struck London. A heatwave baked the sewage, filled river until Parliament itself had to hang soaked curtains in vinegar just to keep the air breathable. Imagine governing an empire while your city smells like despair and decomposition. It was a wake-up call and perhaps the most pungent motivation for urban reform in history. Engineers like Joseph Bazalgette stepped in, designing vast underground sewers that would carry waste away from the city and, theoretically, out of sight and smell. These systems were monumental cathedrals of brick and pipe, and they changed everything. For the first time, sanitation became infrastructure. Clean water wasn't just a luxury, it was civic pride. Across the Channel, Paris followed suit. Baron Haussmann rebuilt the city with wide boulevards, modern waterworks, and a sewage system so advanced it became a tourist attraction. People actually toured the sewers, proof that humanity will find a way to admire its own filth once it's neatly organized. Meanwhile, personal hygiene was evolving just as fast. The Victorians, with all their moral rigidity and social anxiety, turned cleanliness into a religion. Cleanliness is next to godliness wasn't just a proverb, it was a way of life. Bathing became a ritual of virtue, proof that you were civilized, disciplined, and most importantly, respectable. The middle class led the charge. Public bathhouses appeared in industrial towns, offering cheap access to warm water. Soap production skyrocketed, driven by companies like Lever Brothers, the future Unilever, who realized that selling cleanliness could be wildly profitable. Advertisements promised purity, health, and moral superiority, all in a bar of soap. And yet, the Victorian obsession with hygiene was never just about health. It was about control over bodies, appearances, and even morality. Dirt became a metaphor for sin. Poor people were blamed for their own uncleanliness, even when their homes lacked plumbing and their water came straight from polluted wells. Let's float now into a quiet Victorian bathroom, a rare thing of beauty and porcelain. There's a claw-footed tub gleaming under the gaslight, a jug of warm water poured by a servant, scented soaps, brushes, towels embroidered with initials. The bather sinks slowly into the water, not rushing, not splashing, just soaking, genteel and contemplative. The sound of dripping water replaces the echoes of centuries of grime. Of course, not everyone had such luxury. Most workers still washed in tin basins or public baths, often once a week if they were lucky. But the idea of cleanliness had taken root. It was no longer something to fear or avoid. It was modern, scientific, and even patriotic. Empires were measured not just by armies, but by drains and disinfectant. In this same period, dentistry was finally moving out of the shadows. The first toothbrushes made from bone and boar bristles became mass-produced in the late 18th century. Tooth powders, usually a gritty mix of chalk, charcoal, and sometimes burnt bread were replaced by early toothpastes flavored with mint. It wasn't pleasant, but it was progress. The mouth, once a graveyard of infection, was slowly becoming a symbol of civility. And yet, for all the advancements, people still used mercury to fill cavities and arsenic to whiten teeth. Some habits die hard, and sometimes they take the patient with them. By the mid-19th century, public health was no longer just a medical concern, it was political. Reformers like Florence Nightingale argued that cleanliness saved lives. Her work in military hospitals proved that washing hands, changing linens, and disinfecting wounds dramatically reduced death rates. The evidence was undeniable. At the same time, scientists like Louis Pasteur and Joseph Lister were discovering germs' invisible enemies that made filth more dangerous than ever imagined. Lister's antiseptic surgery revolutionized medicine. Pasteur's germ theory reshaped everything from childbirth to laundry. Suddenly, hygiene wasn't just about smell or class, it was about survival. And just like that, the modern world began to take shape. Water was filtered, drains were built, soap was standardized, and the daily bath became a symbol of civilization itself. What had once been feared was now embraced. Humanity had gone from hiding from water to depending on it. But if you listen closely, there's still a trace of irony in it all. After centuries of superstition and perfume, after mountains of wigs and oceans of filth, people finally discovered that the cure for disease was just washing their hands, simple, elegant, centuries late. Let's rest here for a moment, the world, at last, beginning to scrub itself clean. All right, sleepy historians, let's drift into the 20th century, the age when humanity finally figured out hygiene, and then immediately turned it into a marketing competition. By now, people had indoor plumbing, running water, and a general understanding that dirt was not mystical, just inconvenient. But the new century didn't stop there. It decided that being clean wasn't enough. You had to be sparkling, deodorized, sterilized, and preferably lemon-scented. The bathroom became a temple. White tiles, chrome taps, porcelain fixtures, all gleaming symbols of progress. Entire companies built empires on cleanliness. Lifebuoy promised to keep you 100% germ-free. Colgate declared that your smile defined your soul. Lux soap told women that stars like Ava Gardner and Grace Kelly used it, so if you didn't, you might as well give up on being glamorous. Cleanliness, once about health, was now about identity. It was modernity in bar form, and the advertising was relentless. Posters, billboards, and radio jingles all hummed the same message. The clean person was the good person. The dirty one, well, clearly a social disaster. Let's pause on that thought. For thousands of years, people feared bathing because they thought it made them weak or sinful. Now, if you didn't bathe daily, you were weak and sinful in a whole new way. The pendulum had swung so far that a whiff of sweat became a moral crisis. Soap ads in the 1920s and 30s were masterpieces of psychological warfare. They didn't just sell soap, they sold shame. Do you have body odor? One ad whispered ominously. Maybe that's why you weren't invited back. Suddenly, personal hygiene wasn't just about being clean, it was about being accepted, loved, and employed. Toothpaste followed the same path. Early brands like Pepsodent and Colgate invented the idea of tooth film, a vague, invisible threat that only their product could remove. It didn't actually exist, but it sounded scientific enough to panic the masses into brushing twice daily. Dentists were thrilled. For centuries, they had begged people to care about their teeth, and now Madison Avenue did the job for them. Fluoride was introduced, cavities dropped, and mint became the flavor of civilization. The human mouth had never been so celebrated or so monetized. Meanwhile, science marched on. Germ theory became common sense. Hospitals standardized hygiene protocols. Soap evolved from lye-based bars to synthetic detergents. Shampoo emerged as a separate product in the 1930s, followed by conditioners, lotions, and deodorants, all promising a cleaner, better you. And yet, There was an irony in all this scrubbing. For the first time in history, people were too clean. The war against bacteria went nuclear. Antiseptics, antibiotics, and disinfectants wiped out not only disease, but the helpful microbes that had always lived with us. Humanity declared total war on its own ecosystem, and then wondered why allergies, sensitivities, and strange new illnesses appeared. Let's float now into the 1950s, the golden age of the suburban bathroom. A mother hums while scrubbing the sink. A child runs the bath, bubbles rising like miniature clouds. The father smiles in a shaving commercial, his skin glowing with health. Everything is spotless, bright, perfect. Except, of course, it wasn't. Behind the pristine image, cities still struggled with pollution. Rivers were choked with industrial waste. Air was thick with smog. We had conquered personal hygiene, but ignored collective cleanliness. The body was sacred, but the planet disposable. By the mid-century, the obsession deepened. Perfumes and deodorants multiplied. Washing machines and showers became household staples. Magazines declared that a modern woman must wash her hair twice a week and change her sheets daily. It was the gospel of hygiene, and everyone was trying to live up to it. Even the language changed. Words like fresh, pure, and clean became moral terms. Films and ads used cleanliness as shorthand for virtue. The villain was always sweaty, unkempt, or greasy. The hero impeccably groomed. The lesson was clear. Cleanliness wasn't just next to godliness, it was godliness, now wrapped in packaging and sold for 99 cents. Then came the late 20th century, when the pendulum started to wobble again. Scientists began warning that maybe we'd gone too far. The hygiene hypothesis suggested that living in sterile environments might actually weaken immune systems. Children who played in dirt, it turned out, were often healthier than those raised in antiseptic perfection. After centuries of running from grime, humans were rediscovering its strange, necessary benefits. Meanwhile, beauty standards tightened. The cosmetic industry expanded hygiene into high art. Body washes, exfoliants, toners, serums, the modern grooming routine became a marathon. Showers became daily rituals, even multiple times a day. The bathroom was no longer just a functional space. It was a sanctuary. Let's take a slow look around that modern sanctuary. Soft towels, scented candles, steam rising from a rain shower, a shelf lined with bottles promising renewal, radiance, youth. It's peaceful, almost meditative, a far cry from the cold stone floors and communal baths of the Middle Ages. But in a strange way, it's the same story. The eternal human attempt to feel clean, pure, and whole. Because when you peel back the centuries, the perfumes, the powders, the propaganda, hygiene has always been about control. Control over smell, over disease, over death itself. A clean body feels like safety. And safety, in a world that's always been unpredictable, is the closest thing we've ever had to peace. Of course, that doesn't stop the irony. Even now, we buy antibacterial everything, while the earth itself struggles under mountains of plastic bottles and chemical runoff. We are, in a way, back to the same paradox, scrubbing ourselves spotless while living in a mess of our own making. So, if you're listening to this while brushing your teeth, or winding down before a shower, take a moment to appreciate how far we've come. From Romans soaking in olive oil to Victorians scrubbing in moral panic, from perfumed wigs to mint toothpaste, from plague doctors to dermatologists, it's been a strange, soapy journey. And still, beneath it all, one truth remains. No matter the era, no matter the empire, humans have always been just a little afraid of their own smell. Now take a deep breath. Let the water run. The story of cleanliness has no ending, only the next rinse. Hey guys, if you're still awake, congratulations. You've officially outlasted half of medieval Europe's life expectancy. Let's just glide a bit longer, not quite to the end of history, but into the faint, perfumed mist of modern obsession. Because, truth be told, even after thousands of years of soap, sewers, and scientific enlightenment, we haven't really escaped our ancient relationship with filth. We've just learned to hide it behind designer packaging. Take the modern deodorant aisle, an endless fluorescent monument to human insecurity. 24-hour protection, clinical strength, invisible solid, mountain breeze. The irony, of course, is that no one has ever smelled like a mountain breeze. But the fantasy persists that with the right product, we can erase every trace of being an actual animal. And that's really the core of it, isn't it? Cleanliness has always been humanity's polite way of pretending we're not animals. We scrub, shave, scent, polish all to forget that we sweat, shed, and smell like every other creature. Medieval monks fought this truth by avoiding baths. Modern influencers fight it with skincare routines that require a spreadsheet. Both are chasing the same illusion, transcendence through cleanliness. Let's float through a timeline of that illusion. In ancient Rome, public baths were where citizens soaked, schemed, and sometimes philosophized about virtue, all while sitting in water shared with hundreds of others. In the Middle Ages, bathing became risky and suspicious, too sensual, too worldly. By the Enlightenment, people were perfuming the dirt instead of removing it. And in the Industrial Age, we weaponized hygiene to define who was civilized and who wasn't. Today, we've just digitized the same anxieties. Wellness culture tells us to detox, exfoliate, purify. Entire industries profit from our fear of impurity, internal or external. There's charcoal toothpaste, cucumber eye gel, and water bottled from glacial sources. Somewhere, a medieval apothecary is watching and thinking, finally, they understand marketing. And yet, something about this endless cycle is comforting. Every era has used hygiene as a mirror reflecting what people feared most. Disease, poverty, sin, aging, mortality. Cleanliness became a way to fight chaos, to draw neat lines between the body and the world, even when those lines never really held. Let's drift for a moment into something quieter, a late evening in a small apartment, maybe yours. The day's dust still clings to your skin. You step into a shower, warm water humming over your shoulders. Steam curls around you like fog in an ancient bathhouse. You're not thinking about Rome or Versailles or the Victorians, but you're part of the same story. The same ritual, the same fragile, beautiful effort to start fresh. Because if history teaches anything, it's that cleanliness is less about soap and more about hope. Every wash, every brush, every scented candle is a small declaration that we can begin again even if the world outside is still a little grimy. So yes, medieval people had bad teeth. They reeked of garlic and goat tallow, and they thought bathing could kill you. But they also wanted to be pure, respectable, loved just like us. Their methods were weird, their perfumes questionable, their dentistry nightmarish, but the impulse was the same, to scrub away the mess of being human. We've built entire civilizations chasing that feeling, that sigh of clean skin after the grime of the day. And even if science, advertising, and 1,000 brands have complicated it, the simple act remains powerful. A basin of water, a brush, a bar of soap. That's all it takes to feel a little less mortal. So as we close this long, drowsy exploration from plague pits to powder rooms, from royal mouths of ruin to mint, scented modernity, remember that every time you wash your face or brush your teeth, you're continuing a story older than any empire. A story that began with fear and ended, hopefully, with comfort. Cleanliness was never about perfection. It was about peace, and now, maybe, it's time to drift into sleep clean, calm, and aware that even history needed a good rinse once in a while. Good night, fellow historian. May your dreams be soap, scented, and your thoughts untroubled. Hey there, still with me? That's impressive. You've just listened to roughly 2,000 years of dirt, perfume, and panic. So before you drift off completely, let's end this journey not with more scrubbing, but with a little reflection, soft, slow, and honest. Because here's the thing, every civilization thought it had finally mastered cleanliness. Every age believed it had the answers, the perfect soap, the right ritual, the scientifically proven way to make life smell less like life. And yet, each one eventually looked back and said, "Ah, yes, we were disgusting. That's the quiet rhythm of hygiene through time." A constant self-correction. The Greeks looked down on the unwashed barbarians. The medieval clergy pitied the bathing Romans. The Victorians mocked the powdered French. And modern people, with our chemical peels and 10-step routines, look back on them and laugh unaware that, in a century or two, someone will be laughing at us. Maybe they'll dig up our plastic shampoo bottles and wonder why we needed 3 different soaps for one body. Maybe they'll find our anti-aging creams and smile at our terror of wrinkles, as if time could be scrubbed away with vitamin C. Or maybe they'll rediscover simplicity, water, sunlight, and a towel. Back to basics. It's funny, though cleanliness has never really been about hygiene alone. It's always carried a moral undercurrent. In every age, being clean meant being worthy. To be clean was to belong to God, to society, to modernity. The poor, the sick, the outsiders were always described as dirty, even when their only crime was being human without privilege. So maybe that's where our story truly ends or begins again, in the realization that clean is a concept that's just as social as it is physical. Let's float briefly through those echoes of the past one last time. In ancient Rome, slaves scrubbed their masters in steaming baths, while philosophers debated virtue beside the hot pools. In medieval Europe, a noblewoman dabbed herself with rose water, believing it would keep her soul and her skin pure. In Versailles, courtiers choked on their own perfume, pretending not to notice the palace smell like a compost heap in lace. In Victorian England, mothers taught their children to wash, not just to avoid disease, but to prove moral discipline. And now, in the quiet of your own bathroom, with electric lights and hot water at the turn of a tap, you're part of that same lineage. You might not think of yourself as a historian, but every morning routine, every rinse and brush, is a reenactment of everything we've learned and everything we still misunderstand. Maybe that's why the history of hygiene feels so strangely emotional. Because under all the soap and superstition, it's really a story about vulnerability, about the human body fragile, leaky, mortal, and our endless attempt to make peace with it. The dirt we wash away is the same dirt that once made us, after all. We came from the earth, we spend our lives trying to stay separate from it, only to return to it in the end. It's poetic in a slightly damp, soapy kind of way. So, as you lie there, maybe already half asleep, think about how far we've traveled, from primitive caves to marble baths, from chamber pots to sparkling white sinks. It's been a long, aromatic evolution. But at the heart of it, humans haven't changed much. We still crave that feeling, that sigh of relief when the day's grime washes away and the world feels briefly new again. We still light candles, draw baths, brush our teeth, smooth our hair, little ceremonies of renewal that say, I'm still here, I'm still trying, and maybe that's the best ending history could offer. Not victory, not perfection, just the quiet comfort of being a little cleaner, a little calmer, and ready for rest. So, as the sleepless historian might whisper, take a slow breath, let your shoulders drop. The past can wait. Tonight, you've learned that even the grandest empires had bad breath and questionable soap. And somehow they kept going. Now it's your turn to rest, spotless or not. Soft pause. History, like hygiene, is never really finished. It's just rinsed and repeated century after century until we learn, maybe, to be a little gentler with our own imperfections. Good night, traveler through time. Sleep well, stay curious, and remember nobody in medieval Europe had mouthwash. Still here, you must really love history, or you're already half asleep and just letting my voice keep you company. Either way, we're in the soft, twilight zone of this journey, the part where the world fades out and all that's left are faint echoes of the past. Let's drift a little deeper, just for a few more minutes, into something rarely talked about, the smell of history. See, most of what we know about the past comes from what people wrote or built, but scent. That's gone, it doesn't fossilize. It lingers for a moment and then disappears like a sigh. And yet, if you could somehow walk through time, it wouldn't be the architecture that shocked you first. It would be the smell. The Middle Ages, for example, not a dirty period in spirit, but definitely an olfactory challenge. Imagine the narrow streets of Paris in the 14th century. Wood smoke, tallow candles, open drains, horse manure, incense, stale ale, lavender, sweat, and bread baking somewhere in the chaos. A symphony of life and decomposition. The Renaissance wasn't much better. Italy smelled of citrus and sewage. England smelled like damp wool and mutton, and the courts of France, they reeked of perfume trying to drown its own despair. Perfume, by the way, wasn't just vanity, it was survival. People genuinely believed that good smells could protect you from disease. The logic went like this. Foul air caused sickness, so fragrant air must create health. A nobleman walking through a plague-ridden city might hold upon under a little metal ball filled with herbs and spices to his nose, as if rosemary could ward off death itself. Even doctors joined the ritual. 17th century plague physicians wore those long, beaked masks not as a costume, but as protection. The beak was stuffed with dried flowers, camphor, and vinegar, soaked cloth. They weren't wrong that it helped a little. At least it masked the smell of decay while they worked. And that smell, the real heavy odor of unwashed humanity, followed us for centuries. You'd think wealth would help, but ironically, the richer you were, the worse you often smelled. Nobles layered on musk and ambergris, both animal products, believing the intensity made them irresistible. It did not. Royal bedrooms, even in Versailles, were airless worlds. Tapestries trapped smoke. Perfume clung to powdered wigs. The scent of lilies and rot blended into something that could only be described as aristocracy. But smell wasn't all bad. Some scents defined eras like new parchment in monasteries, beeswax candles in chapels, or freshly crushed herbs in a healer's hut. The medieval world wasn't just filth. It was alive with fragrance, both beautiful and awful. And as centuries passed, smell became class. Clean linen, for instance, didn't just mean you'd bathed it, meant you could afford water, soap, and servants. The smell of freshness became a kind of social currency. When laundry became fashionable in the 18th century, people noticed. Linen that smelled faintly of lye and air was a badge of status. Clean wasn't about invisible microbes yet. It was about smell, a moral odor that said you belonged to the right kind of world. Fast forward to the modern day, our obsession with scent hasn't disappeared. We still want to smell like something, just not ourselves. We buy ocean breeze at candles, though most of us have never smelled the actual ocean. We spray morning mist on our pillows, though morning mist mostly smells like damp pavement and dew. We've replaced authenticity with imagination, but the instinct is the same, to mask, to define, to comfort. If there's one universal truth about human beings, it's that we've always been slightly ashamed of being biological, of smelling like what we are alive. So maybe that's the real story here. The history of hygiene isn't just the history of cleaning. It's the history of denial, of trying to transcend our own bodies. Every bath, every perfume, every ritual was an attempt to make mortality smell just a little less mortal, but maybe, just maybe, there's something peaceful about accepting it. About knowing that every king, every peasant, every saint and scholar, all of them had moments of smelling like onions or horses or candle smoke. History is human, and humans have never been sterile. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, don't picture shining marble baths or spotless courtiers. Picture something truer: a flickering candle, a basin of cool water, a faint scent of lavender, and the gentle sound of someone washing their face after a long, dusty day. Because that's the real heart of it, not perfection, not purity, but the quiet relief of washing the world away for just a moment before rest. And that's where we'll leave it. The water's gone still. The candles are out. The air smells faintly of soap and stories. If you're still here, somewhere between waking and dreaming, that's perfect. This last stretch isn't history exactly. It's a soft landing, a slow dissolve back into the present. Because every time we talk about the past, about kings, queens, plagues, perfumes, and chamber pots, we're also talking about ourselves. The same fears, the same vanity, the same longing to feel a little less mortal. It's strange comfort, isn't it, knowing that even emperors once worried about bad breath. Let's linger a moment in that shared humanity. Picture an old medieval bathhouse, candlelight glinting off copper basins, voices echoing softly through steam. Maybe a monk hums somewhere in the corner. Maybe a merchant tells the same story he's told a dozen times, just to hear it again in the haze. the smell of herbs, the warmth of water, the sound of quiet laughter. Centuries later, in a tiny Victorian washroom, a woman pours water from a jug into a porcelain bowl. She scrubs her hands and face, humming to herself, watching the grime turn the water grey. She's tired, but she feels. New again, and now you. Different time, same ritual. A tap instead of a jug, electric light instead of candlelight. But the feeling, the same. A small, private victory over the day. Maybe that's why stories like these matter. Not because they teach us how far we've come, but because they remind us we've always been trying. Trying to be clean, to be good, to be loved, to be remembered. And history, when you strip away the noise, is really just a long collection of those small human efforts repeated endlessly. There's a peace in that thought, that no matter how grand the palace or how humble the hut, every life had its quiet moments of washing, of rest, of reflection. You can almost hear it if you listen closely enough. The soft sound of water running through the centuries. Pause so as the story fades. Let's not end on filth or fragrance, but on gratitude. For the people who endured their eras, who kept things going, who scrubbed and swept and boiled and perfumed their way through time so that we could inherit a world that smells most days a little fresher. And for you, listener time traveler, sleepless historian in your own right, thank you for walking through this strange, scented history. You've wandered through Roman baths, medieval kitchens, plague doctors' masks, and Versailles' perfumed halls. You've seen humanity at its most earnest and absurd, and now the torches are out, the air is still, history rests again, you can too, close your eyes, the past is clean enough for tonight, a long, calm silence. Then a final whisper, we've washed the centuries away, good night.